It's okay.
Good afternoon. On behalf of President Charles HIrschman, I am honored to welcome you to the 2005 Presidential Address and Award Ceremony. We will begin first recognizing 3 of our members for their professional and scientific accomplishments. Each of 3 awards will be presented by the respective committee chair, and first we'll begin with the presentation of the Dorothy S. Thomas Award by Shoshana Grossbart-Schechtman. Shoshana?
Don't worry about
Good
it.
afternoon. Dorothy Swain Thomas was one of the founding figures of American demography, and she did some very important studies in migration. And it is in her honor that we are giving out a prize today to Jason Fletcher, a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin in applied economics. And the paper who is getting the award is called Social Multipliers in Sexual Initiation Decisions Among U.S. High School Students. It's an excellent paper, and we're the committee and I are very happy to give you your award, and you're going to be receiving it in a few minutes.
The next award is the Robert J. Lapham Award that will be presented by Ren Farley.
Thank you, Marta. It's an honor to chair an award committee of the Population Association because you have the delightful duty to present a plaque, a certificate, and a check for cash to the winner. Let me thank my colleagues on this committee, including Steve Ruggles, Jeff Bissell, Frank Mott, John Hobcraft, and Rob Mayer. We remember the many contributions of our colleague Robert Lapham by giving this award in odd years. It recognizes contributions that blend scholarly investigations with the application of demographic research to policy issues. This year, our winner perfectly fits the criteria. Trained as an economist at Columbia, he originally studied and published about income transfers within the household. He continued with analyses of family issues, including the determinants of fertility, and then carried out the most comprehensive studies of those rises in divorce rates that characterized the baby boom cohorts as they matured. While never losing his interest in family demography, our winner understood that if survey research were broadened, we could gain new insights about several important demographic and policy concerns. Thanks to his innovativeness and guidance, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth was expanded in several ways, including gathering psychometric data from children. We now know much more about the cognitive development of youngsters and the transition from youth to adulthood because of the survey research innovations of our winner. Since the time of John Grant, demographers have been broken down by age and sex. But until our winner devoted his energies and efforts to it, we had no representative national survey telling us about the actual sexual practices in the United States. Thanks to his efforts, we now do. Few of our members have been as effective as he has been in bringing demographic findings to the attention of those who design policy. Fortunately, he does so in a manner that fosters additional studies and generates research funding for those investigations. I think of the volume he edited with Connie Citro for the National Academy about measuring poverty, and the role he has had in shaping survey research focused upon child development. He is one of the leaders serving our profession elegantly by expanding our horizons pragmatically and intellectually in the core research areas of childhood, early adulthood, cognitive development, and adult sexuality. I am very pleased to present the Association's 2005 Robert Lapham Award to Bob Michael of the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy.
Thank you so much, Ren. I've had the pleasure of serving on some of these selection committees and am keenly aware of how many very deserving award potential recipients there are out there, which humbles me to be the recipient this year, and I greatly appreciate the honor. Thank you very, very much.
And finally, the Irene Teuber Award will be presented by Guillermina Hasso.
I am deeply honored to present the Irene B. Teuber Award on behalf of the Population Association of America and the Office of Population Research at Princeton University, and representing the chair of the award committee, Linda Waite, who unfortunately is unable to be here. Irene Teuber was president of the PAA in 1953-54, and 8 years later, vice president of the IUSSP. Her scholarly contributions included 16 monographs and books, and some 250 articles. Her magnum opus was The Population of Japan, published in 1958. She worked tirelessly to inform demography with a comparative and international perspective. The Teuber Award is presented in recognition of an unusually original or important contribution to the scientific study of population, or for an accumulated record of exceptionally sound and innovative research. It is presented every other year at the annual meeting of the association and consists of a cash award and a certificate. The award was first given in 1977. You will find on the PAA website the complete list of winners, but I will name the first 4 and the last 4. The first person to be honored with the Teuber Award was Lewis Henry, who was followed by Kingsley Davis, Ronald Friedman, Samuel Preston, and in the last 4 years, Gary Becker, Ronald Lee, James Vopel, and Ron Lestagi. On Linda's behalf, I would like to thank the members of the award committee. It was a daunting task to select this year's winner from among an outstanding field of nominees. This year, the Teuber Award goes to Susan Cots Watkins. Watkins has worked in Teuber's tradition, bringing international and comparative perspectives to demography, and particularly to the most intimate aspects of demographically relevant behavior, sex and death. Her research began with a study of fertility declines in Western Europe in 1817 to 1960, proceeded to demographic behaviors of US immigrants in the early 20th century, and thence to fertility in developing countries and to AIDS in Africa. She has considered a wide geographic range and interactions of social networks at the global, national, and local levels, from efforts of Western organizations with a global reach to control population growth and prevent the spread of HIV, to networks of national governments and non-governmental organizations, to social networks of ordinary people in which they debate and alter international and national advice to change their behaviors. Watkins long has been and continues to be engaged in an extraordinary journey across time, space, and social science techniques, a journey unified by her all-consuming quest for better understanding of the part played by social networks in many important demographic phenomena. Along the way, she has engaged many minds, from graduate students to eminent scholars, from 4 continents, from many disciplines, not only her native sociology and demography, but also economics, medicine, and anthropology. This is an intellectual journey that both merits the recognition of and thus honor to the Teuber Award. Susan, I am proud to present you with the Irene B. Teuber Award.
I'm very pleased by this award, all the more so because I feel some connection with Irene Teuber. We were both at OPR at Princeton, and we both smoke. But we were in different cohorts, such that the women's movement separated us. Irene, despite her major contributions that were enumerated by Willie, did not have a faculty position at tenure at Princeton, whereas later it became much easier for a woman to, even one with 2 kids, as I had, to go to graduate school and to get tenure. My work has largely been on social networks, and I've practiced what I preached, drawing both inspiration and expertise from a wide variety of social network partners. So I want to acknowledge my intellectual networks here, especially the co-authors from whom I've learned an enormous amount. I'm going to begin with graduate students, and I'm going to name them so that you will recognize their names when you see them on their name tags at the reception and know just how terrific they are. These are current and former graduate students: Simona Bignami, Angela Chiwaza, Agnes Chabiri, Andrew London, Nancy Luke, Kate Miller, Arotis Robles, Kirsten Smith, Linda Toffick, Ina Warner, Kevin White, and Aliyah Zulu. In addition, they're faculty co-authors who I don't need to name, but I will anyway, in reverse chronological order. There at the beginning in graduate school were Jane Mencken and James Trussell, Etienne Vanderwall, and then Myron Gutman. Then in US work, Alice Goldstein, Phil Morgan, Doug Eubank. And then as I left the developed countries, my first guide was Naomi Ruttenberg. Then I worked with John Bongartz, Bob Pollack, Dennis Hodgson, Amy Kaler, Jerry Berman, Hans-Peter Kohler, Gigi Santow, and Michael Brasher. And at last, with 2 new co-authors, with our first joint work presented at these meetings, John Cleland and Ann Swidler. These network partners have been crucial for me, and I want to thank them all.
We expected standing room only, but there are actually some chairs here for those of you who would like to move up. You don't have to stand through this. It is my honor to introduce to you our President, Charles HIrschman. He is Boeing International Professor in the Department of Sociology and the Daniel J. Evans School of Public Policy at the University of Washington, where he joined the faculty in 1987 after holding appointments at Duke and Cornell. At the University of Washington, Professor HIrschman directed the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology for 8 years. He chaired the Department of Sociology for 3, and he maintains an active affiliation with the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and the Policy School. In 1965, Miami University in Ohio awarded Professor HIrschman a BA degree, which he put to good use as a Peace Corps volunteer in Baling, Malaysia from 1965 to 1967. There he met the love of his life and his lifelong partner, who he married in 1968. By that time, he had returned to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he earned a PhD in 1972. Their son Andrew and daughter Sarah are in attendance this afternoon, along with Andrew's 2 grandsons ages 4 and 2, and their daughter-in-law. In academia, the measure of the man, to borrow a phrase from Drake and Caton's Black Metropolis, is judged by contributions to research, to teaching, and to public service. Professor HIrschman is a first-class social scientist with world renown. His international reputation was earned in the field, in the classroom, as a mentor, through service on influential national and international advisory committees, and through his distinguished contributions to scholarship. In over 100 scholarly articles and chapters that populate the most prestigious journals and edited volumes, his scientific contributions focus on immigration, ethnicity, and race relations, on social stratification, and on demographic and social change in Southeast Asia, where he has deepened his intellectual footprints by learning Malay, Indonesian, and more recently Vietnamese. His academic accomplishments have been recognized through numerous honors, fellowships, and awards, including Fulbright Hays, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Center for Advanced Study in the Social and Behavioral Sciences, to name but a few. Professor HIrschman's scholarly and academic contributions are a matter of public record, not opinion. Yet, the man friends and colleagues affectionately call Charlie measures even higher in the currency of life and the metric of human values. In a surprise celebration of Charlie's nth birthday, his current and former students and colleagues were unanimous in describing how he makes each feel special. Since we met at a barbecue on Jim Sweet's driveway nearly 3 decades ago, I too always felt special and lucky as Charlie's friend and his intellectual colleague. Now I know that hundreds of others whose paths he has crossed feel special too. It's just Charlie's way. In Charlie's world, there are no bad people, only good people. Friends stay friends, and co-workers become lifelong friends. It's just Charlie's way. In Charlie's world, only family can compete with work, but family extends beyond any sociological or anthropological definition anyone here might imagine, crossing continents and every boundary that separates people. Where there are barriers or gulfs, Charlie builds bridges and multiplies possibilities. It's just his way. In Charlie's world, students are infected early with unbridled enthusiasm and optimism about their possibilities. Students are taught the highest standards of scientific excellence, academic integrity, and teamwork through example. Students receive constructive criticism laced with positive commentary. Students learn firsthand the difference between an advisor and a mentor. It's not orchestrated. It's only Charlie's way. In Charlie's world, there is merit in both highly innovative but risky research endeavors and incremental contributions from normal science. Inherently diplomatic and more concerned with the common good than with his personal goals, Charlie always does due diligence so he can play out his values about scientific merit through the force of logic. On more than one occasion, I witnessed him single-handedly save solid and highly worthwhile projects that would have been nixed by the study section and others facing sure rejection because they were too risky. Science is better off because Charlie got his way. In Charlie's world, the open door policy prevails. People trump deadlines, values, and science trump ideology. So quintessentially Charlie's way. Recently, Charlie published an op-ed piece in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer where he called on Americans to become global citizens by learning history, culture, and beliefs of other peoples, by volunteering for the common good, and by befriending the stranger. These 3 steps, all within the reach of most, are his ideals for moral leadership. Charlie and Joe know as well as anyone, they have been there and done that. In Indonesia, in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Vietnam, and in communities that host Duke, Cornell, and the universities of Wisconsin and Washington. In trying to summarize what Charlie is all about, a quote by Mahatma Gandhi comes readily to mind. "My life is my message." This seems especially apt for Charlie and Joe, whose lives are their message. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you President Charles HIrschman, Charlie, who will speak on immigration and the American century.
Thank you, Marta. I promised I wouldn't cry when Marta read her introduction, but almost. My sentiments about the Population Association of America were expressed some years ago by Nathan Kiefitz, when he said that our annual meetings were a cross between the most intellectual gathering of any learned society and a high school reunion. You can walk randomly into any session at these meetings, and regardless of the topic, you will learn something new. Indeed, something of value for your research, for your teaching, or perhaps a topic for a future lunchtime conversation. And around every corner at the PAA, you will bump into a friend with whom you will begin, but not necessarily complete, a warm and interesting conversation, before it is interrupted by another chance encounter with yet another friend. While the frequency of these encounters is a function of the length of exposure to prior meetings, it is still fairly high even for our newest members. Being PAA president is a great honor. It's also a lot of fun. And it's an experience that exceeds all of my career ambitions and expectations. I wish that I could say that I entered the field of demography with some foresight of the adventures and rewards and challenges that I would experience, but it was mostly blind luck. I entered graduate school to study leadership in rural Malay villages and thought that my demography traineeship would be a short-term source of funding until I found my real calling. Within a few months, I discovered that demography was my only possible calling. In contrast to other branches of study where obscurity seemed to be sometimes valued above all else, demography set great store on simple logic and data to clarify the complexities of the world. Moreover, I liked my fellow demographers. They were friendly, unpretentious, Midwesterners in spirit, if not in origin. I have not gotten to this point in my career. I've not gotten to this point in my career by myself. I've had teachers, students, postdocs, colleagues, friends, family, pulling and sometimes pushing me at every step along the way. An old Malay proverb says that you can repay debts of gold, but you must carry debts of kindness to the grave. I have quite a few debts of the many kindnesses that I've received, and I'd like to mention just a few of them. First, my teachers. Being a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin in the late 1960s was a unique experience. In addition to the excitement of the times, I witnessed the birth of the Wisconsin School of Social Demography. My mentors taught me how to do research through collaboration, encouraged me when I needed it the most, and gave me the freedom to go my own way when I was ready. At Duke, Cornell, and for the last 18 years at the University of Washington, I've had wonderful colleagues, postdocs, students who have taught me the value of a good idea, new research methods, and when to change course when my ideas were not working as planned. It would take hours to mention all of you and tell what you mean to me, but rest assured, I know who you are and why you deserve much of the credit for my accomplishments over the years. Many international friends and colleagues, especially from Southeast Asia, have been a critical part of my life. In addition to my Peace Corps service and research in Malaysia, I worked extensively with colleagues in Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and especially in Vietnam over the last 25 years. I'm profoundly grateful to my international friends for welcoming me into their communities, their homes, and even their families. Finally, my greatest debt is owed to those who have given me refuge from the storms of life and provided meaning whenever I had doubts. My wife, Jo, my children, Andrew and Sarah, their families, and my grandchildren have given me more joy and happiness than I can describe. That's it? No, I have an address. Demographers, like historians, often identify time periods and eras that capture an important event or trend. Some of these represent abstract time, such as stages in the demographic transition. Others are more firmly rooted in historical time and place, such as the periods identified with the American baby boom, the post-1965 wave of immigration, and the amazing decline in mortality in the decade following World War II. For my assignment today, I've taken the 20th century, or at least the American experience of the 20th century, as the period to apply the demographer's ken. There's an urge to take stock of individual lives in our collective history whenever the calendar passes a mark with one or more zeros. Crossing the decadal, centennial, and millennial marks all at once is almost irresistible. I must admit that the objective of trying to come to grips with the 20th century is also driven by personal considerations. And in spite of all the hype and fanfare about the new millennium, I and my generation are creatures of the 20th century. The outlook of each generation is shaped by the unique intersection of history and biography. Taking stock of the 20th century is akin to trying to understand the social forces that have shaped the lives of those of us who came of age in mid-20th century America. This era is sometimes called the American century, which connotes the economic ascendancy of the United States during the first half of the century and its political and military hegemony in the post-World War II era. I would suggest, however, that America's symbolic position in the 20th century is at least as important as its economic and military power, and the symbolic role is likely to be the dominant historical legacy. This symbolic role has many components, but one of the most influential is that American identity is not rooted in nationhood, but rather in the welcoming of strangers. Philip Kazanitz has argued over the course of the 20th century, the Statue of Liberty has replaced the Revolutionary War icons as a preeminent national symbol. The Founding Fathers did not intend for the United States to become a nation of immigrants, but that is what happened. The Statue of Liberty was given to the American people by France to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the independence of the United States. Although the statue was intended to symbolize Franco-American friendship and the freedom of American society, the statue has acquired a new identity as a beacon of welcome for people seeking new and better lives for themselves and their children. This interpretation owes much to the poem by Emma Lazarus, who welcomed the huddled masses and the homeless from other lands. Although the American government and people have not always embraced immigrants, the image of the United States as a land of opportunity and refuge has become our preeminent national identity at home and abroad. In my essay today, my aim is not to recount what immigrants have done, though that is part of the story, but rather to explain how immigrants and their children have remade American society over the 20th century. To paraphrase Oscar Hanlon, immigration is not simply part of American history, rather immigration is the principal wellspring from which so much of America's dynamic character and identity have originated. First, in the early decades of the 20th century, and then again over the last 3 decades, Major waves of immigration have altered the composition of the American population, with profound consequences for the structure of cities, the economy, politics, and American culture. I will even argue that immigration, along with pre-existing sources of population diversity, has created a more cosmopolitan and tolerant society that is much less susceptible to monolithic claims of American nationalism. This chart represents the standard conceptual framework for the study of immigrant adaptation and assimilation. The central premise is that immigrants to America first become part of an ethnic community. For most immigrants, it takes time, perhaps a generation, before they lose all traces of ethnic distinctiveness. Eventually, the lines between the ethnic community and the broader society become blurred, and there are few remaining differences except for the occasional expression of symbolic ethnicity. This chart outlines an alternative, though not opposing, perspective, which treats the receiving society as the dependent variable. The changing shape and color of the diagram labeled society symbolizes changes in American society, its institutions and culture, as immigrants become active participants, as workers, political actors, and creators of culture. Making these claims is one matter. Substantiating them is quite another. In my presentation today, my objective is to provide an outline of the argument and to present some preliminary evidence. I am confident that others will search for additional evidence that may support or refute these claims. In either case, the field will be advanced. This is an outline of my major points. I begin with an overview of the magnitude and patterns of immigration to the United States, and then review the evidence of the impact of immigration on population diversity, cities, the economy, and American politics and culture. A word on terminology. I use the term immigrants and the foreign-born as synonyms, though technically and legally they are quite different. The second generation refers to the children of immigrants, and the balance of the population is referred to as the third and higher generations. The historical trend. The 1880 to 1924 age of mass migration, primarily from Europe, and the post-1965 wave of immigration, primarily from Latin America and Asia, are bookends of the 20th century, and they represent a longer history that began in the 17th century and may well continue far into the future. This figure shows the trend in immigration from 1850 to 2000. The columns show the absolute count of the foreign-born enumerated in each decennial census. In absolute numbers, the size of the foreign-born population more than tripled from 4 million in 1860 to just shy of 14 million in 1920. Following the near closing of the immigration door to Southern and Eastern Europe in the 1920s, they closed even earlier to peoples from Asia, the numbers of the foreign-born fell steadily for the next half-century, reaching an all-time low of less than 10 million persons in 1960 and 1970. The curved line shows the foreign-born as a proportion of the US population at each census. In 1860, after a decade of the largest relative immigration in American history, about 13% of the population was foreign-born. For the next 60 years, the ratio of immigrants to the population remained about the same level, about 1 in 7 Americans. Then the relative size of the foreign-born population declined precipitously, and only 1 in 20 Americans alive in 1970 was an immigrant. Growing up in small-town Ohio in the mid-1950s, the only immigrant I knew was my neighbor, Max Krisch. Mr. Krisch was a German bachelor immigrant and who lived with his sister, and together they ran a small farm where I worked during school vacations. With their accents and old world manners, Max and his sister were all the diversity that I was exposed to in mid-20th century America. With the return of immigration to the main stage of American society in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, the number of foreign-born tripled from less than 10 million in 1970 to more than 30 million in 2000, and proportionately, the foreign-born increased to over 11% of the population. My current life is filled with immigrant voices, from the students and faculty at my university, the classmates and friends of my children, the farmer's market where I shop, and even the civil servants with whom I have contact in local and state government. Of course, Seattle is a far cry from small-town Ohio, but even there, in the mid-1990s, the local upscale restaurant of choice was run by Vietnamese immigrants. Immigrants were much less visible in mid-20th century America, not only because of their smaller share of the population, but also because they were much older, much less likely to be out and about, less likely to be in the workforce, at PTA meetings with their children, and in other public venues. There's a clear relationship between the age composition of immigrants in eras of mass migration. The visibility of immigrants also depends on geography. Most immigrants live in cities, while old stock Native Americans are much more likely to live in rural areas and small towns. Furthermore, the count of the foreign-born underrepresents the magnitude of the immigrant community because native-born children of immigrants are excluded. The children of immigrants are reared, at least in part, in the social and cultural world of their immigrant families. The values, the stories, the languages of immigrants are part of the cultural heritage of the children of immigrants. This chart shows the funny age distributions of the first and second generations relative to a normal age distribution of the third and higher generation populations. The first generation appears to have too few children, and the second generation has a huge bulge in the 0 to 14 age category. If considered in isolation, these demographic portraits would suggest that the first generation resembles the population of Norwegian bachelor farmers that Garrison Keillor talks about, and the second generation is a population of abandoned children. In fact, the first and second generation typically live together under the same roof. Treating only the first generation as reflecting the presence of the immigrant community is misleading. With this understanding, let's consider an alternative time series to represent the presence of the immigrant population across the last century. This chart shows the share of the US population for three components of the immigrant community from 1880 to 2000. For the data heads in the audience, some of these figures are interpolations, trust me. The first definition of the immigrant population is simply the foreign-born, which we saw in the preceding chart and is represented in the top portion of this figure. As noted earlier, the foreign-born population declined from around 14% in the early 20th century to less than 5% in 1970 and has bounced back to almost 12%. The second component, the pink color here, includes the native-born who live in households with an immigrant householder. Most of these are dependent children of immigrant parents, but others in this category are native-born spouses of immigrants and other relative and immigrant households. Defining the immigrant community as inclusive of all persons living in families with a foreign-born householder seems to conform to the everyday sense of the term. A more expansive definition of the immigrant community might include the second generation who do not live in immigrant households. This is the third area from the top, the light blue. Although some of the second generation may have no identification with their parents' birthplace, and most probably have some sense of belonging to the immigrant world, perhaps from hearing stories about life in the old country and the struggles of their immigrant parents to make it in America. In this broadest definition of the immigrant community, all three curved areas at the top of this chart, the current share of the population with recent familial roots in the cultures and languages of other countries is closer to 1/5 or 1/4 of the national population, in contrast to the typical estimate of slightly over 10%. For the non-South, that is the North, Midwest, and West combined, the immigrant share of the population was closer to 1/3 in 2000 and was almost 1/2 in the early 20th century. What difference does it make whether the immigrant community is a little more than 10% or approaching 1/4 of the population? Well, almost everything, from ethnic relations, economic demand, political constituencies, and exposure to cultural diversity. Let's begin with diversity. Immigration has been the primary cause of the growth of the American population from a little less than 4 million in 1790 to over 270 million in 2000. Edmonston and Purcell estimate that the current American population would be only a little more than a third of its current size if it included only the descendants of those who arrived after 1800, those who arrived before 1800. Beyond population size, the most notable impact of immigration has been the broadening of the social and cultural diversity of the American population. This table provides a summary portrait of ethnic diversity of the American population in 1900, 1970, and 2000. From our current perspective on race and ethnicity, the American population was very homogeneous in 1900. Altogether, American Indians, Asian Americans, and Latinos comprised only about 1% of the American population in 1900. In 1900, African Americans were 12% of the population, but they were regionally concentrated mostly in the rural South. The most visible manifestation of diversity in 1900 was the multitude of nationalities, languages, and cultures that were within the white population. A century ago, more than a third of the population was composed of immigrants from Europe and their children. About half of the immigrant community in 1900 was considered to be old immigrants, meaning that they came from the traditional sending countries of Great Britain and Northwestern Europe. The rest were described as new immigrants and included Italians, Slavs, Greeks, Poles, Eastern European Jews, and many other groups from Eastern and Southern Europe. In the early decades of the century, these new immigrants were often considered to be non-white and subject to considerable hostility and prejudice. A variety of groups ranging from the Ku Klux Klan, the Progressive Movement, old-line New England aristocrats, and the eugenics movement were amongst the strange bedfellows in a campaign to stop immigration that was deemed undesirable by old-stock white Americans. Thomas Mueller observed that speeches by Klan members against immigrants were virtually indistinguishable in substance and language from the writings of many university professors. The passage of immigration restrictions in the early 1920s ended virtually all immigration except from Northwestern Europe. In spite of the hostility against the new immigrants and the vitriolic campaign against continued immigration, the children and grandchildren of Southern and Eastern European immigrants experienced considerable socioeconomic mobility and were gradually absorbed into the overall white population through intermarriage over the course of the century. By 1970, early 20th century immigration was only a distant memory. In 1970, more than 8 of 10 Americans were non-Hispanic whites, and almost 7 out of 10 were third and higher generation non-Hispanic whites. The immigrant roots of the white population were primarily evoked for expressions of symbolic ethnicity on parades of St. Patrick's Day and Columbus Day. The study of immigrants had largely disappeared from sociology textbooks and was barely kept alive by a dwindling band of immigration historians. Diversity was a term that had not yet come into everyday discourse. In 1970, the only component of diversity on the national agenda was the pervasive inequality between white and black America. The stark differences between the gradual processes of integration and inclusion experienced by immigrants, by the descendants of white immigrants, and the persistence of discrimination and segregation experienced by African Americans led to a focus on the apparent immutable reality of race as opposed to the more impermeable notion of ethnicity. With the renewal of immigration from 1970 to 2000, there's been a renaissance of population diversity, including English spoken with accents by peoples from dozens of countries from around the globe. Initially confined to California, the New York region, and southern Florida, the new immigration wave is now reaching across the country. From 1970 to 2000, the overall share of the national population composed of American Indians, African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans increased from less than 13% to over 30%. The share of the African American population inched upward from 11 to 13%, largely due to immigration. The relative share of Latinos and Asians grew by 7 and 4 percentage points respectively, almost entirely due to immigration. These sharp increases have been accompanied by an expansion of immigrants beyond their places of historical concentration. Mexican Americans have become a national minority with a presence in most cities, and even in many southern rural areas that have not experienced immigration in over 200 years. Puerto Ricans and Cubans have spread beyond New York and Miami to nearby suburban areas and beyond. Asian Americans have become part of the national landscape and a visible presence on every college and university campus. National origin groups that scarcely existed in the American imagination in 1970, such as Asian Indians and Vietnamese, had by century's end established all the trademarks of American ethnic communities, including recognizable areas of settlement, newspapers and periodicals in their home languages, and popular cuisines whose reach extended far into Middle America. The second half of the 20th century witnessed two countervailing trends. The first was the domestication of the white population as the foreign-born segment of white America largely disappeared. The second trend was the resurgence of immigration beginning around 1970 that led to an expansion of diversity with the establishment of Latinos and Asians as part of the American ethnic panorama. If we consider the percentage of the majority population with no foreign roots, the third and higher generation whites, as an index of homogeneity of the American population, then the United States was less diverse in 2000 than in 1900. Only 54% of the population was in this category in 1900, compared to 62% in 2000. Will the new immigrant population in the 21st century follow the path experienced by the new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe in the middle decades of the 20th century? There are reasons for optimism, but also some concerns. A number of studies have found that overall, most immigrants and their children are making socioeconomic progress, especially in education. Assuming continued socioeconomic mobility and moderately high levels of intermarriage, history might well repeat itself, and the children of the post-1965 wave of immigration may well be absorbed into the American mainstream. My only hesitation in making such a prediction comes from the disinvestment in public institutions that have historically fostered the social mobility of the children of immigrants and others from modest circumstances. Robert Merton described the rich quality of public institutions available to him as a child of working-class Eastern European immigrants growing up in Philadelphia in the 1920s. Young Merton grew up close to a public library and to public schools that were staffed by dedicated women concerned for his education and welfare. The nearby settlement house brought opportunities for artistic development and even chamber music performed by the Philadelphia Orchestra. Merton claimed that as a youngster in a seemingly deprived South Philadelphia slum, he was able to acquire every sort of capital except financial, the others were social, cultural, and human, that facilitated socioeconomic mobility. I wonder whether the resources of comparable quality will be available to the children of poor immigrants in contemporary American inner cities. I now turn to the topic of the impact of immigrants on cities. Amos Hawley observed, the crisis of the city, and crises are endemic in cities, is the crisis of change. Technological innovation, commerce, freedom of thought, and economic opportunities typically have their home in towns and cities, and so do most immigrants. In the early years of the 20th century, America was still a country of farms and small towns. This was especially true for old stock Americans. Almost 2/3 of third and higher generation whites lived in rural areas in 1900, compared to only a quarter of the foreign-born. The cities of America in the age of industrialization were primarily immigrant cities. In 1900, about 3/4 of the population of many large cities were composed of immigrants and their children, including New York, Chicago, Boston, Cleveland, San Francisco, Buffalo, Milwaukee, and Detroit. In spite of many hardships, many immigrants remained in American cities, as did their children, and in doing so, they helped to build the foundations of the modern 20th century economy. For persons with the right set of education, skills, and ambition, the urban economy offered opportunities for social mobility that were impossible in any other location. But for most white Americans with limited skills and ambitions, it was not at all obvious that a menial factory or office job in a city was a step upward from living on a farm or a small town. In addition to the familiarity of family and friends, the farm economy offered autonomy, flexibility of work, and a safety net of a minimum food basket. None of these were necessarily available for those who sought their fortunes in the city. By mid-century, the heart of many great American cities, especially in the Northeast and Midwest, have begun to experience economic and social and demographic declines. There were many causes, but one of the most important was the development of the automobile highway complex that allowed the middle class and much of the white working class to move to suburbs in the periphery of large metropolitan areas. About at the same time, immigration to the United States began to pick up steam, and as in earlier times, immigrants were drawn to cities. At present, the foreign-born are about twice as likely as the native-born to live in the central cities of large metropolitan areas. This chart shows the trend in the absolute population of New York City by nativity from 1900 to 2000. For the first 7 decades, New York City grew in size despite the pulls from the growing suburban ring. The last 3 decades of the century show 2 very different trends. The native-born were leaving New York and immigrants were arriving. During the 1970s, the exodus of more than 1 million native-born from the city could not be offset by the arrival of 250,000 additional immigrants. The 1980 population of the city fell by more than 10%. During the next 2 decades, the loss of the native-born continued, though more slowly. The population decline of New York was halted with the arrival of more than 400,000 immigrants in the 1980s and double that number in the 1990s. Fueled by a resurgence of immigration, the 2000 population of New York City rose to its peak of several decades earlier. New York is an exceptional case, but the pattern of net outmigration of the native-born is a trend shared by Chicago and many other large cities in the Northeast and Midwest. In some cities, immigration has been sufficient to keep the central city from declining, and in others it is merely able to slow the decline. During the 1990s, the role of immigration as a counterweight to declines of the native-born population has spread to many more cities in the country, including Philadelphia, Detroit, Baltimore, Indianapolis, Columbus, Milwaukee, Memphis, Washington, D.C., and Boston. In most cases, the number of immigrants is only in the range of a few tens of thousands and makes only a small dent in the continued pattern of population decline or very slow growth of many large cities. Although immigrants cannot be the sole solution to the problems of the central city decline, the presence of immigrants, especially their smaller businesses, have brought some measure of hope and vitality to American cities that have fallen on hard times. Now I turn to immigrants and the American economy. Immigration adds more workers, and just like the addition of any other factor of production, immigration contributes to an expansion of the nation's economy. However, there are widespread popular beliefs, including many influential voices within public policy circles, which assume that immigration is harmful to the economic welfare of the country, especially to native-born Americans. However, neither economic theory nor empirical evidence supports such negative assessments. As a bit player on the National Research Council panel on the demographic and economic impacts of immigration, I learned that there was a remarkable consensus amongst leading specialists in labor economics and public finance on the impact of immigration on the American economy. Economic theory predicts that immigration will expand labor supply and increase competition for jobs and lowers wages for native workers who are substitutes for immigrants. But a corollary of this thesis is that immigrants expand total national income and increase the income that accrues to the native-born workers who are complements to immigrants. The indeterminate part of the theory is the division between native-born workers who are substitutes and those who are complements. The simplistic gloss is that workers are substitutes and capitalists are complements. But these categories are not necessarily people, but sources of income. Many workers have direct or indirect income from capital through their savings, ownership of property, and as recipients of pension programs. Moreover, many ordinary workers have jobs that appear to be complementary, not competitive to immigrant labor. This means that many native-born workers may get pushed up rather than being pushed out with the arrival of unskilled immigrant labor. Regardless of the complexities of economic theory, the overwhelming body of empirical research cannot find any evidence of negative effects. The National Research Council summarized the empirical findings of the literature in labor economics. Point 1, and I'm just quoting from the report, the weight of empirical evidence suggests that the impact of immigration on the wages of competing native-born workers is small, possibly only reducing them by 1 or 2%. Point 2, the evidence also indicates that the numerically weak relationship between native wages and immigration is observed across all types of native workers, white and black, skilled and unskilled, male and female. These findings have led to a revisionist hypothesis that immigration does not adversely affect low-skilled workers in locations with lots of immigrants, say Los Angeles or New York, but the negative effect is observed in the national labor market, which adjusts through internal migration. In other words, the negative impact of immigration is experienced by migrants who leave LA or New York, or those who would have migrated to LA or New York in the absence of immigration. There is no consensus in this very complex and contested area of research, but I am persuaded by the work of David Card and his colleagues, which finds very little evidence of migration of low-skilled native-born workers out of high immigration areas, or of a widening of the wage gap between native high school dropouts and workers with higher education. What might really resolve this debate would be an experiment in which we could parachute large numbers of immigrants into a city and see what happens to the earnings of native-born workers. Actually, history has provided a natural experiment along these lines. In September 1980, about 125,000 Cubans, mostly unskilled workers, arrived in Miami, Florida during the Mariel boat lift. Although the workforce of Miami was instantly increased by about 7%, there were no measurable changes in the wages of employment of the native working class in Miami, including the African American population. My reading of the literature is that immigration probably does lead to the displacement of some native-born workers in some sectors in a manner similar to technological change in international trade. However, immigrants also stimulate the economy through their role as consumers, investors, and entrepreneurs. Moreover, a good share of the savings gained through the lower wages of immigrant workers is passed on to native-born consumers through lower prices into native-born workers in sectors which experience growing demand. The observed net effects of immigration of about zero on the wages of native-born workers may well be a composite of these negative and positive effects. There are many other important findings from the NRC study, as well as the fascinating literature on the impact of immigration on the transition from an agrarian to an industrial society in the early 1900s. Although there are many conflicting findings and debates in the literature, I do not find systematic evidence that immigration negatively affects the American economy, past or present. Now I turn to the impact of immigrants on politics. Most immigrants tend to be fairly apolitical. They are often slow to naturalize and are more concerned with the problems of day-to-day survival and their children's chances of upward mobility than with engagement in American politics. Nonetheless, I suggest that the children and grandchildren of immigrants who arrived during the age of migration from 1880 to 1924 played a major, if not decisive, role in 20th century American politics. And in particular, I suggest that their influence tipped the political balance that led to the creation of the modern welfare state in the 1930s and the elimination of official racism in the 1960s. Major changes in government policy usually follow from a transformative election in which the governing party is able to break from past practices and compromises. This has happened twice in 20th century American politics. In a short window in the mid-1930s, Roosevelt and his congressional allies passed laws that created the seeds of modern social democracy for workers and their unions, established Social Security for the elderly, and founded institutions such as the TVA that were responsive to the economic needs of peoples and regions that were left behind. The second major period of reform was from 1964 to 1966, when Congress established Medicare, an unfinished New Deal program of economic security, and enacted a series of civil rights bills that eliminated official support and sanction for discrimination in accommodations, hiring, voting rights, and housing. And for good measure, the 1965 immigration reforms ended the infamous national origins quotas of the 1920s. Most of these reforms came after Johnson's victory in 1964 that established a huge Democratic majority in Congress. The reforms of the 1930s and 1960s helped to alleviate, though not completely solve, the deep fissures of class and race in American society that had threatened to pull it apart. I do not contend that the elections of 1932 and 1964, which brought about these periods of reform, were the direct result of immigrant voters. In both cases, there was an overwhelming national mandate with support from every branch and root of the electorate. However, these national mandates followed on the heels of the 1928 and 1960 elections, which set the stage for what followed. In the 1928 and 1960 elections, the role of immigrants and the descendants of immigrants loomed large. The seeds of the 1932 Roosevelt Coalition were established in 1928 when Al Smith, an Irish-American Catholic from New York City, attracted immigrant urban voters to the Democratic Party. Although Hoover defeated Al Smith, more than 120 northern counties that had consistently voted Republican went for Smith and the Democrats in 1928. A number of scholars have attributed the shift from the Republican dominance of the government in the 1920s to the overwhelming New Deal coalition of the 1930s, to the increasing share, turnout, and partisanship of the urban ethnic vote following 30 years of mass immigration. It is more of a stretch to make the case that the immigrant vote made a difference in 1960. Only 9% of the population aged 25 and above in 1960 was of foreign birth, and many of these were not naturalized and eligible to vote. However, 20% of the US population in 1960 in the voting ages was second generation, all of whom were eligible to vote. The role of the second generation in mid-20th century American politics is not framed in terms of immigration, but of religion. There's a high overlap, however, between the descendants of the last major wave of immigration from 1880 to 1924 and religious affiliation. Most of the Southern and Eastern European immigrants were Catholic and Jewish, and disproportionately Democratic. In the post-World War II era, white Protestants, especially the middle-class white Protestants outside the South, have been the base of the Republican Party. In any election victory, there are many fathers who wish to claim paternity. In addition to the claims that Lyndon Johnson's presence on the Democratic ticket or the ability of then Mayor Richard Daley to turn out enough Chicago voters to deliver Illinois to the Democratic side, the presence of the 20% of the voting age population who were the children of immigrants surely made a major contribution to Kennedy's victory. And without Kennedy's election, it is unlikely that the Great Society and the civil rights agenda of the mid-1960s would have been enacted. To be sure, the second-generation immigrants who voted for Kennedy and Johnson probably did not expect major policy changes in race relations. The civil rights movement, powered by the African-American community under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King and his colleagues, put civil rights on the national agenda. But it took a reform-minded administration, which saw Medicare, Head Start, and ending Jim Crow as complementary parts of the national agenda. The ending of de jure apartheid in the South and de facto apartheid in the rest of the country is perhaps the greatest achievement of 20th century America. There remains a long ways to go before the color line is erased. It is almost impossible to comprehend the revolutionary changes in civil rights, in post-civil rights American society relative to prior decades. There is a generational dynamic in the political preferences of immigrants. Immigrants and their children tend to vote liberal because of their identity as newcomers and outsiders and their below-average socioeconomic status. As the children and grandchildren of immigrants move up the socioeconomic ladder, there's likely to be a shift in affiliation toward the conservative end of the political spectrum. But framing the political differences as liberal versus conservative can obscure the underlying issues of interest. New immigrants are primarily concerned with the presence of an economic safety net for those who cannot fend for themselves, and for economic opportunity for those who can. These issues are not fundamentally different from the concerns of the broader American population, but immigrants and their children have historically been more sympathetic to the message. Immigrants and American culture. If we consider popular culture as the artistic representations of a society, then perhaps one indicator of American culture might be the views of society that are captured in Hollywood movies, Broadway plays, and popular music. Of course, there's much more to culture than art, but the popularity of art tells us that portraits of life and human emotion captured in these expressions resonate with the public, perhaps revealing cultural ideas that people value. My claim is not that Hollywood stories represent your or my life, but that Americans spend a lot of time and money on movies, plays, and other cultural accounts of American society, and therefore the production and content of mass entertainment reveals something important about the society. Even for those who disagree about the merits of popular culture, I suspect that most everyone would agree that Hollywood and Broadway are authentically American institutions. However, it is remarkable that immigrants and their children of immigrants have played a formative role in writing, directing, producing, and even acting in American films and plays for most of the first half of the 20th century. The names in this chart are the 17 Hollywood film directors who have won 2 or more Academy Awards as reported in the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences database. Although there are other methods that might be used to define the universe of the most highly regarded film directors of the 20th century, this list represents the critical acclaim of members of the film industry. In this chart, I've reorganized the names of the film directors by immigrant generation. 9 of the 17 multiple recipients of Academy Awards for directing are immigrants. Another 4 are second generation. Only 4 are third or higher generation Americans. I've done a similar analysis of the leading composers, lyricists, and performers in Broadway musicals in the middle decades of the 20th century. The results are in the same direction, though less striking. The majority are second generation, and several of the most important composers of Broadway music, such as Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, are third generation. Why were immigrants overrepresented as Academy Award directors and in other creative roles in Hollywood and Broadway? This question requires a digression on why talented outsiders are often drawn to highly rewarding but highly risky careers. In many cases, it is because there are limited opportunities to pursue mainstream career paths. Robert Merton's theory of social structure anomie posits that youth whose paths to conventional success are often blocked turn to deviance. Immigrants and minorities often lack the resources and connections to get ahead through conventional careers, so they find work in ethnic enclaves or in fields that are open to talent, such as crime and professional sports. Immigrant concentrations in small business, crime, and other high-risk careers are generally temporarily, usually only lasting a generation, until their children are able to obtain an education and pursue more conventional careers. In his discussion of the overrepresentation of Jews in the entertainment industry in the early 20th century, Irving Howe observed, "The entertainment industry brushed aside claims of rank and looked only for the immediate promise of talent. Just as blacks would later turn to baseball and basketball, knowing that here at least their skin color counted for less than their skills, so too in the early 1900s, young Jews broke into vaudeville, because here people too ask not who are you, but what can you do?" Incidentally, in the 1930s, when many fields were closed to Jewish Americans, they were overrepresented in college and professional basketball. The second question is how creative artists with a foreign heritage are able to connect with a mass audience, American audience, and to produce films and plays and music that Americans outside of the immigrant community see as quintessentially American in content and sensibility. For example, Irving Berlin, who was born as Israel Belin in Russia and immigrated to the United States as a child, wrote many of the standard American classics such as God Bless America, White Christmas, and Easter Parade. The composers and lyricists who wrote much of the standard American songbook were largely second and third generation Jewish immigrants who were reared in ethnic enclaves, but went on to write the musicals that have become the staples of high school productions, such as Oklahoma, Annie Get Your Gun, and South Pacific. In addition to sheer raw talent, perhaps there's something about being slightly outside the dominant culture that gives an edge of insight to an artist. A biographer of William Wyler, who won a record 12 Academy Awards nominations for directing, observed that Wyler was fascinated with America and things American. And as a foreigner, he was able to see things from the point of view of an interested, sympathetic outsider. Another advantage of outsiders is that they were able to sometimes rise above the prejudices and closed minds of insiders. Many native white Americans did not initially appreciate the truly original and authentic genius of jazz music. perhaps because of its origins in the African American community. Jazz performance and the first generation of African American jazz musicians operated on the margins of the mainstream music industry for the first few decades of the 20th century. Popular taste began to change in the 1930s when some white band leaders, most notably Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw, began to draw inspiration from jazz and to integrate their bands. Both Shaw and Goodman were second-generation immigrants from Jewish American roots who blended traditional European musical traditions with the vitality and improvisation of jazz. In addition to the higher motivations to succeed and willingness to take risks, immigrants and their children have two understandings of how the world works: their own cultural framework they brought with them and the new culture that they acquire in the host society. This idea has parallels with Robert Parks' marginal man hypothesis and the African American necessity of double consciousness as described by W.E.B. Du Bois. There's no doubt that being part of two cultures can be psychologically uncomfortable and in some cases incapacitating. However, for some is an asset that sparks creativity and inspiration. Immigrants may see new possibilities for entrepreneurship, greater awareness of cultural nuance, and for greater insight into how our art can capture the essence of emotions and lived experience. In a society that has relatively few cultural touchstones, immigrant artists and others who live in multiple cultural worlds are free to define Americanness in novel ways. My conclusions. In conventional accounts of American history and contemporary American society, immigrants are considered part of the story, indeed a very important part of the story. The tales of how peoples from different parts of the world have arrived in a new land with relatively few resources, but through dint of hard work and family sacrifice, eventually joined the American mainstream is part of the national epic. The storyline is how immigrants become Americans. In my presentation today, I've offered an alternative interpretation of the relationship between immigration and American society. Immigrants do, of course, adapt and become more similar to other Americans over time. The complementary point, as noted by Oscar Hanlon, is that American history is really the story of successive waves of immigration. Or, as I have tried to extend Hanlon's thesis, 20th century American society and culture are not simply products of continuity from our 18th century origins, but have been reshaped by immigrants over the last 2 centuries. With very few national myths and a founding population that no longer holds demographic, symbolic, or real power, the image of the United States as a nation of immigrants has become our national identity and ideology. This was not meant to be. Although there were a few periods of anti-immigrant sentiment early in American history, immigrants were freely admitted and generally welcomed to the United States throughout the 19th century. After the land had been wrested from its original owners, the American frontier represented virtually unlimited opportunities, and most immigrants were generally thought to be pretty similar to the original founding stock of the nation. Tolerance ended, however, with the arrival of Asian immigrants on the West Coast in the 1850s and 60s, and Southern and Eastern European immigrants in subsequent decades. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first step toward a closed society. 4 decades later, the door to Southern and Eastern European immigrants was also closed. Passing the national origins quotas in the early 1920s was a victory for the old guard of American society, which staked the claim that the old stock Americans of English Protestant origin were the founding population that defined the national character. With nativist fears to arouse the masses and pseudoscientific eugenics to convince the educated, the proponents of immigration restriction seemed to be firmly in charge. Their victory, however, was ephemeral. Only 4 decades later, the immigration door was reopened, and American cities were again buzzing with the arrival of new immigrants from around the world. Immigration restriction was doomed because tens of millions of new immigrants who arrived from 1880 to 1924. They and their descendants have profoundly altered the structure and culture of American society, and once they had their turn in American politics, they overturned the national origins quotas. The legacy of the 1880 to 1924 immigration includes a major role in the development of the modern industrial economy and the reorientation of the Democratic Party that led to the New Deal and the Great Society. The new immigrants and their children have also made important contributions to the development of American culture and national identity. The Hollywood theme that anybody can make it in America is a particularly Americanized version of the rags to riches story, and one that is particularly appealing to people such as immigrants who are striving for upward mobility. Many Hollywood and Broadway productions have also given us particular poignant accounts of outsiders who have to struggle to be understood and accepted. Is this an immigrant perspective? Yes, but I do not wish to suggest that all of the American creative arts draw upon the aspirations and creative energies of first and second generation Americans, but some of them do. The new immigrants who arrived since 1965 are also changing the structure and culture of American society in new directions that cannot be clearly seen at present. One important direction, I believe, is the creation of a more cosmopolitan and tolerant society. Many new immigrants and their children have mastery of difficult-to-learn languages, and they have opened up new cultural horizons through their ethnic cuisines, music, and arts. International issues from the conflicts in the Middle East, in Eastern Europe, to the political currents of Mexico and Central America, and the spread of the Asian economic miracle are matters of particular interest and concern to Americans who maintain familial, social, and even economic ties to the lands of their birth. The children of immigrants inevitably lose many of the distinctive attributes, including the language skills and personal knowledge of their countries of origin. However, the children of immigrants often broaden the base of the cosmopolitan society through the creation of multicultural families. The majority of young native-born Japanese and Chinese marry outside their communities. Estimates of the intermarriage rates for other Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans range from 25 to 50%. Patterns that are comparable to the historical experience of white ethnic groups. The children of intermarried couples are likely to be an important bridge to a more tolerant society. Having both an Italian and Irish ancestry may make one somewhat less likely to accept jingoistic claims about the depravity of foreign cultures and societies. Having both an Eastern European Jewish heritage and a Korean Buddhist family may make one less likely to believe that religion is destiny or that American society should be monolithic in terms of its cultural traditions. In sum, the presence of immigrants is a hedge against the parochial view of us versus them. Many of us are them, and even if we are not, we increasingly have neighbors and members of our extended families who are. Perhaps, just perhaps, the creation of a society of blended ancestries united by a common civic identity may point the way for the broader world to the end of ethno-nationalism, the pernicious ideology that has justified so much of the conflict and misery of modern times. This may be the real legacy of the American century. Thank you very much.